Hello, I'm Herminia Ibarra, Faculty Chair of the INSEAD Leadership Initiative. We have with us today Robin Ely, Professor of Organizational Behavior at Harvard Business School, and an expert on gender, race, and diversity. Robin, we've looked at the numbers. Everybody's talking about the numbers. You have at the entry level in most business organizations a situation that's very close to 50-50 men and women, and as we all know, that pipeline withers away to perhaps 10% at the top. What's happening? What do you see from your research in terms of the barriers that women face on the road to leadership roles?
I usually think about the barriers as being of two kinds. One I call structural barriers, and these are aspects of the organization itself that really make it difficult or more difficult for women to rise into leadership roles. And those barriers really stem primarily from the fact that most organizations were constructed by men, for men. And so they're organized in such a way that makes it a little bit easier for men to find their way through, given that men and women have different constraints on their lives outside of organizations. If organizations don't take that into consideration, and they're only kind of thinking about men's experience, then the avenues to leadership roles are going to be much easier for men than they are for women. And what ends up happening as a result is, as you say, there are very few women at the top, and that itself becomes a structural barrier. So with fewer women at the top, women coming up through the ranks have fewer role models and create
mentors.
Fewer role models for mentors, just less access to information that might come through networks that are primarily populated by women. We know that people tend to network with people who are similar to them. So women may network not just with women, of course, with men as well, but to the extent that they're networking with women as people who are similar to them, the people in their networks are not likely to be ones who are in more senior positions and, giving them information and access and opportunities in the way that that happens for at least some men, a higher proportion of men. So those are the structural barriers. And then there are also just attitudinal barriers, and the two are obviously related. But there's a cultural assumption about who women are and how they're different from men. And there are cultural and organizational assumptions about what it takes to be a competent leader. And unfortunately, the stereotypes that we tend to hold about women are run counter to what we think of as the traits that would make for a successful leader. So we think of women as caretaking and nurturing, and very often and more recently we think of leaders as taking up those roles as well. It looks different when a woman takes them up. It's something that's sort of seen as supposedly coming naturally to women. It's not really seen as leadership competence in the way that it is when men do it. So what happens is we find, and there's a lot of research to support this, that women end up in a double bind, where if they try to enact the traits that are seen as leaderly, and these tend to be the traits that are more associated with idealized images of masculinity, they tend to be respected for that, but not necessarily liked. Whereas if they take up a more stereotypically female role of being nurturing and caretaking, they may be liked but not necessarily respected. And so that's the double bind. And so a lot of scholars are now sort of talking about how women leaders have to trade off competence for likability, and that's something that their male counterparts don't have to do.
So if women can't be competent and likable, or competent and warm and accessible, what do you do? How do you walk that fine line? Should you walk that fine line? What would be your advice to a woman faced with that double bind?
Well, I think the advice that women seem to be getting now, and this is sort of a lot in the media, this issue of the double bind, I think the advice that they're getting is actually not very good, and that is, you need to make sure that you are walking this fine line, that make sure that you're warm enough so that you're seen as likable, but not too warm so that you're dismissed, and then you have to be masculine enough so that people take you as competent, and it's this sort of, I think, impossible situation for women.
Well, we saw that with the U.S. presidential election, where on the one hand Hillary Clinton was getting messages that she wasn't something enough, and as she tried to adjust, questions were raised about her authenticity.
Right.
Is it really her?
Right.
And so what you seem to be saying is if you try to manage to the double line, you will be viewed as a fake, and so it's self-defeating.
Well, I think not only might you be viewed as fake, I think you're basically, as we definitely saw with Hillary Clinton, she, what one person sees as warm enough, another person doesn't see it the same way, and you're always going to be, if you're trying to navigate that line, I think you're never going to satisfy everybody because people have different points of view about
so what's
enough.
the answer? Is it the be yourself?
It's not a sort of a question about authenticity in the sense of, look to yourself and see who is the real me. Am I really warm? Am I really this? Am I really that? No, I think that the task of leadership is about advancing a collective goal. And what I would advise to women is to not worry so much about the image, because it's draining to spend all your time worrying about how this person is seeing me or that group or whatever it might be. There are stereotypes out there. They're going to be attached to you. At the end of the day, I believe that women's competence is going to be measured by how much they get done. And I think being attentive to the needs of followers, understanding when they need one kind of leadership versus another, and really enacting that in the service of something that sort of the leader and followers are there collectively to accomplish. I mean, this isn't a sort of popularity contest. This is about getting work done. And at the end of the day, I think really good leaders, whether they're men or women, quite frankly,
that's what they do.
That's what they do. They advance a collective goal, and they understand that sometimes it requires one kind of style, and sometimes it requires another. And so I think the capacity to really be able to read followers and to, well, I say followers, right, to read the group, read the needs of the kind of constituency around you that you're trying to lead is going to be far more effective than worrying about image management.
Most organizations I know are really trying to get a handle on this and would very much like to improve their numbers and are certainly spending a lot of money in all kinds of diversity programs. Based on your research, what would you recommend? What can organizations do to get better results for their efforts and to really pave the way for more women leaders at the top?
Well, I think one thing that they can do is to, and this goes back to those structural barriers that I was talking about before, and really taking a hard look at a lot of taken for granted practices and policies in the organization, and really looking at the ways in which those the way that work gets done, the way things are normally done in the organization, really taking a look at whether those have a differential effect on men and women. And I think that what I've seen when organizations really take a hard look at themselves and really look at things like the language that they're using when they're evaluating men and women, or looking at simple things like when they hold meetings, knowing that very often women are the ones who are responsible, of course, for child care, and even if they're not taking care of the children, they're responsible for picking them up from child care, which means they've got work hours that are more constrained than men. Sort of taking a look at the norms of organizations and how some of the things that organizations are doing and the way they get their work done and the way they're defining things are having a disproportionately negative effect on women. And that's a complicated and messy process.
It's harder to dig into how work gets done than to simply create a program.
But I think that what you said is exactly right. We're not seeing a lot of benefit from diversity programs, and there's some research that suggests that that's the case. And it's because I think there's been a wish on everybody's part, quite frankly, that they could solve the problem with a program. I'm not saying that programs are, unnecessary. I'm not sure that we're necessarily doing the right kinds of programs. But I don't think a program is going to fix the problem.
Well,
it's a deep problem.
There's been some interesting work that's come out recently that shows that most progressive companies have in place some kind of measurement systems. They have in place networks for women. They certainly have in place different kinds of flexibility programs, but very few of them actually take a look at their leadership pipeline, how it's developed, their succession planning, leadership training for women. Can you speak to that? What's been your experience? What do you think works in that realm directly concerned with developing leadership in women?
Well, I do think that women face a different reality in organizations. I don't necessarily think that, quite frankly, and this is maybe a controversial thing to say, I don't think men and women are fundamentally different from each other. I think that they experience the same kinds of anxieties and they have the same kinds of stresses and so on and so forth. But I do think that they confront a different reality. And so I'm a big fan of leadership development for women. I know that that's a bit controversial and that some women sort of feel that they don't want to be singled out as someone who needs to be fixed. And I don't think of it as fixing the women. I think of it much more as equipping women to deal with the situation that they're confronting, which is very often different from the one that men are confronting.
Should the content of the leadership development program for women be different than the content of a leadership development program that is mixed, includes both men and women? Or is it simply the fact of bringing women together in a leadership program? Which do you think is the...
I think it's both. I think there is real value to just bringing women together and having them connect with each other and share their experiences. So I think that alone is valuable as an aspect of leadership development. All leaders need to learn how to embrace the kind of mission of the group that they're leading and figure out the way to mobilize the group toward that collective goal. So that's not different for men and women. But I think that because women do face some different barriers around being able to do that, that it's helpful to bring them together and have them
to discuss what may be the challenges that they might share with regard to mobilizing people towards a collective goal.
No, I mean, I think that said, it's sort of interesting as I think about leadership development and I think about what we were talking about before with the image management. Looking at women's experience in that respect actually, for me, also informs what we ought to be doing with men around leadership development. So I think there's really, it's one of these sort of times of what I call, learning from diversity. Taking a look at the situation that women confront. There are elements of that situation or ways of navigating around that situation that might be similar for men.
And helpful to
and helpful,
them.
Equally helpful to men. I mean, we may not think so much about these sort of public image issues and how much they get in the way of actually exercising effective leadership, except when we look at women struggling with trying to find what is that image. Well, men don't struggle with it so much. I mean, there's a kind of clearer sense of what that image is for them. So they work with it and they spend a lot of time on it. And my question is, is that really an effective way for them to be spending their time? And maybe looking at women's experience actually tells us something also about how to advance leadership development for men.
And how to approach that differently. Thank you very much, Robin.
You're welcome.